Thank you, Anna, and very nice to see you, all of you, specifically Cha, who I know very well, of course. So welcome everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to have a talk. I will watch the time a bit. So I have until 1:30, right?
You have 30 minutes, but we are not so strict. So
then I have to speak
take your time.
Then I have to speak very fast. Okay, so I will talk about blockchain technology and specifically very decentralized innovation ecosystems. Well, people who know me a little bit better expect that there will be E-trivial models, but I can proudly say that in this presentation there is no E-trivial model at all. If you are curious to that, you have to look for some other courses we provide. What are we going to talk about? Well, about blockchain platforms, blockchain in fair ecosystems, and also platforms. So I will first explain you what I mean with ecosystem and platforms. This is a definition we often use. It basically defines an ecosystem that consists of what we call economic actors, so usually enterprises or governments or NGOs or people like you and me who buy stuff, and they depend on each other for their economic survival and well-being. That's how we see it. I was yesterday in a meeting with someone who I told that I was working on ecosystem research, and for at least 10 minutes she was thinking that I was doing biology. That's not the case here. We're talking here about business ecosystems, so ecosystems between usually enterprises and all kinds of other parties. There are many examples in the world. Nearly every undertaking that you see in practice is part or is a ecosystem itself. But you all know, of course, iOS from Apple, which is a very closed ecosystem, meaning that Apple is the central party here, and that the whole ecosystem is designed such that you have to pay or to buy nearly everything from Apple. So the hardware, even some software. Probably you have seen the recent discussions between game developers and the Apple App Store, where they have to pay ridiculous amounts to Apple just for having their app listed in the App Store and so on. So Apple is a very centralized ecosystem that we see. Much more decentralized is, for example, the automobile industry with car manufacturers, but also garages, governments, people or companies maintaining roads, petrol stations, and so on and so on. So this is a very big ecosystem with many parties, and perhaps there are some very important parties, but the main message is it consists of many parties. What you see today quite often is that closely related to ecosystems, people talk about platforms. And what we see, or what we think, that is the platform is basically a sort of infrastructure for actors in an ecosystem. And in most cases, the platform itself is also an ecosystem. And we know platforms ourselves. Uber, for example, is a platform for people who want to book a taxi ride on the one hand, and for individual taxi drivers on the other hand. Android from Google is a platform. There are many examples. And usually we distinguish two kinds of platforms. The first one are so-called abstraction platforms. These are platforms that provide services, and in our terminology, usually commercial services to others. So, for example, Android from Google provides services to people who want to offer their stuff, for example, via the App Store. And there are also interaction type of platforms, and I mentioned already Uber, which is basically a mediation platform between, on the one hand, people who want to have a taxi ride, and on the other hand, individual taxi drivers. So that's an example of an interaction platform. Well, a few examples. I already mentioned the platform, the Android platform, which is obviously run by Google. In the middle of the picture, Google uses services from, or in this case, devices from smartphone hardware platforms, Sony, Samsung, LG, and so on. What we saw in the recent past with Huawei is that this is a very important relationship, because the American government decided to boycott UI quite extensively, which has an enormous influence on the company. So apparently Google, and in direct relation to that, the US government has a very powerful relationship, very powerful position in this platform. And on top of Google, there are so-called what we call complementers. These are in Google Android situation, all the parties, the numerous parties there are in the App Store, for example, Google itself with Gmail and so on, but also Facebook and many other applications that you can find in the App Store. So this is an example of a what I called an abstraction platform. Then we have another example, which is Netflix. This is a video streaming platform. This is already a slightly more complicated picture. Again, this is a platform which is very much centralized, in the sense that Netflix is obviously the most important player here, and the same holds for the Google or for the Android platform. So there are all kinds of companies needed for Netflix to provide us movies and series as customers. For example, they have to interoperate with right management societies. They also produce content to differentiate themselves from, for example, Disney. They also buy content from other content providers who are IP holders and so on. And at the bottom, perhaps you know that Netflix does not have its own infrastructure really, but it runs on the Amazon cloud service, where they host the streaming platform, and they have some other relationships with banks, postal services, and so on. I will come back later on Amazon presentation. Again, this is a very centralized platform. So what is precisely the problem with ecosystems and platforms that I at least have, and also some other people? Well, this is more or less the problem. This is, we try to model lots of decentralized ecosystems, and one of them is one you all know, Amazon. This is only a very high level picture showing that in what kind of operations Amazon is involved. The bad news of this picture is that this is not even complete. So this shows only a very limited view of what Amazon is. And if I pick out some details, we'll know Amazon from the bookstore that they have, so at the left top of the picture. But Amazon is also a marketplace where others can sell their stuff, and already for a long time that's much more than books. Also all kinds of other products you can think of. And what Amazon actually does very well is, as soon as they discover that a particular product category is very popular in their marketplace, they are the first one to start a physical or a shop themselves in the marketplace to sell the product to. Here you already see a bit, let's say, doubtful behavior. That they very closely monitor which products are selling well in their marketplace, and if they discover that it sells well, they start their own business with it. They have their own app store. They have also services for intermediation between employers and employees to find them. They have health services. You know them, of course, from all kinds of home automation products, like also Alexa speech recognition at the bottom. They have all kinds of digital services, for example, the hosting of Netflix, but also their own video services. They have their own logistics parties. They have their own airline to do provisioning. Probably you read in the news that they also experiment with drones to deliver the products to your home, and so on, and so on, and so on. So Amazon as a company is not a single company. It's a belief that one company basically can do it all. And we see them now also coming in Europe, and they try to impose this same model also in Europe. So it's very, very, very extensive. What's even worse is the WeChat platform in China. I will not discuss it in detail, but WeChat originally started as a messaging platform, but now it's very dominant, visible in the life of nearly every Chinese person, with lots and lots of services, including our government services, by the way, that they offer. But they offer much, much more, and they are very dominant. This is Facebook. Facebook is, compared to others, you won't expect it, but it's still a bit more modest. On the one hand, you have users that basically buy that view ads, and on the bottom you have all kinds of networks to sell those ads to companies who want to do their advertisements. And this model even includes recent initiatives like the Libra, which is a story in its own right. But even also with Facebook, you can have many questions like privacy issues, of course, but also with the recent ban of Donald Trump, you can ask yourself if Facebook is the party who should do this ban. So the same holds for Twitter, actually. Let's say you can discuss if this ban is correct or incorrect, but you can also discuss whether Facebook and Twitter and all these other parties are the entities to decide about this. So I hope I a bit explained the problem, namely that all these parties or ecosystems are very centralized ecosystems. And I gave just a few examples, but there are many more. For example, Spotify, Uber, Airbnb, Booking.com, and so on. These are all examples of what we call centralized ecosystems. And centralized ecosystems have, if you study them, you can very soon discover a pattern. For example, that usually they spend lots and lots and lots of money upfront from investors to create their market. So from Uber, for example, we know that they simply bought taxi rides by either subsidizing the people who want to have a taxi ride or to subsidize the taxi drivers. And this had just one goal, to increase their market share such that they become very dominant in the market. So they buy market share. Netflix does something similar. They very heavily invest in TV productions or series productions. For example, in relation to Disney, and huge amounts of money are spent there just to get a very competitive and dominating position. And what they do, and that's one of the problems, is once they have reached this domination in market position, they increase their prices. So usually the strategy is to start with very low prices, even prices that are that low that every other competitor has to leave the market space. And once they are the only one left, they increase their prices substantially, and that leads to very high profit margins. Usually these platforms which are centralized have 30% or more profit per year, which is very, very high. And if you have read the newspapers the past few years, you have also seen that they have a very unfair treatment in relation to other parties in the ecosystem. So what's well known is that Amazon has serious problems in dealing with their employees. So, for example, in the US, employees try to organize themselves in unions, which Amazon tries to discourage in every way. Uber is quite recently forced to pay drivers a minimum wage, pensions, and so on. But this also indicates that they didn't do that before, meaning that they paid very low wages. In the Netherlands, we are the not so proud host for Booking.com. Booking.com in the recent news, they received from the Dutch government about 55 million euros for the Corona crisis. And they pay, I believe, 100 million euros even, and they paid this year 50 million euros of bonuses to their top managers, which is caused a lot of debate in the Netherlands. And with Facebook, there are many scandals, but I think the most well-known is the Cambridge Analytica case, where they sold data of their users. So there is a pattern of, let's say, global misbehavior of these centralized ecosystems, and that's really a huge problem. Now we think, or at least I think, that one interesting research challenge is to think about how we can create so-called fair ecosystems, because these centralized ecosystems that I just mentioned lead often to very unfair treatment from their employees. The suppliers, they will get very low prices. Customers, they have to pay very high prices. And even on the country level, there is tax avoidance and all kinds of other nasty things you don't want. So from a social perspective, these centralized ecosystems are really not desirable. I think it's they try to achieve monopolies. They treat parties not very well in many cases. It reminds me a bit to the period of time where the European countries have some colonistic behavior. Well, I see this as a sort of digital colonistic behavior, and that's not what we should want as a society, I think. So there is a need for fair ecosystems, and for us IT people, also the question then is, okay, what kind of technological solutions are needed? Because what we see is that most of these centralized ecosystems are possible due to technology, and specifically the internet. And talking about the internet, if you speak with the inventors of the internet, most of them say that this decentralization of very large parties was not the idea that they had. In fact, the idea was quite the opposite, to have decentralized and sort of equally balanced play field. So what happens right now, the huge centralization we see is not what was the original idea of the people who invented the internet. So the question is, how do we come to let's say, fair ecosystems? And there are two things that are important to that question, I think. And the first one is decentralization. So if you just analyze all these centralized platforms that are there, and we analyzed quite a lot of them, not only the ones that I showed you, then centralization obviously does not work in terms of fairness. So a better way or to try out would be decentralization, a better balance in power in these ecosystems. And our assumption, or our working assumption, is to arrive at these fair ecosystems, you should have fair governance of these ecosystems, so fair control. So the assumption is that if we have fair control or fair governance of these ecosystems, then their operations, so what they do in practice in the field, will also be fair. And governance in ecosystems means to us that the rules that a system, the ecosystem, or the platform has to obey, and these rules are set by some other system, and a system can be parties, enterprises, us, whatsoever. So that's the assumption. And that means that you have to develop some notion about what you think that a decentralized fair governance actually is. And there is some work on that done in the past. The references are shown at the bottom of the slide. And these people say that fair governance comes with a number of aspects. First of all, it requires active participation and also decision making of all those who are infected. And if you compare that to Facebook, for example, then it would not have been possible that Facebook in its own right decided the ban of Donald Trump, but that, well, some committee or whatever type of decision process you design for that would have taken that decision. But also, let's say, how profit is distributed over all the parties would be a governance decision in which all the parties should participate. What comes also with governments is the rule of law. This can be legislation in some cases, but in many cases it's also, there are cases of self-regulation where a company says, or an ecosystem says, I want to stick to these and these rules. All parties should comply to those rules and should be treated equally according to these rules. So, and let's say, not only treating and behaving according to these rules is a point, also the decision process, how to arrive at this rule of law, is a topic of attention. Then there is also the issue of transparency, namely, you don't want that people have to take decisions without lack of information, with having the wrong information. All information should be available to everyone to make fair decisions. It should be responsive. So if you have an issue that an ecosystem has to decide upon, that should be done with a reasonable time frame, let's say a couple of weeks, not a couple of years, which we see quite often. And finally, the participants should be accountable for their actions, meaning that we should track and trace basically what people do, what they decide upon, and if they behave accordingly. So these are some, let's say, requirements for decentralized fair governance. And now I switch to the notion of blockchain, because the question that I want to discuss is, okay, how can blockchain technology help to arrive at such fair ecosystems, and specifically at fair governance of such ecosystems? And to discuss that, you first should understand what blockchain is. Well, I guess a number of you will do, but for those who don't, I will briefly give an overview. The central claim of blockchain is that it allows for an ecosystem without any intermediate centralized party that they control. So in other words, blockchain allows for decentralized ecosystems. So the whole idea of blockchain is that centralized parties are not important or even not needed anymore. That's for the operations. What you also need with blockchain technology, and what is currently lacking to a large extent, is a decentralized governance model. To give you an example, if we have the Bitcoin that you probably all know, this allows for paying without having any intermediate party, in this case a bank, involved. So that's in terms of operations. But if you look at the persons or the entity that determine the Bitcoin protocol, you will pretty soon discover that there are only a couple of hundred people who decide upon that. Bitcoin ecosystem is much larger. So the governance model of Bitcoin, basically the system that determines the Bitcoin protocol, the rules of engagement, and so on, the governance of the Bitcoin system is not very decentralized at all, actually. For ICT4D cases, I think there is another reason why you should use a blockchain technology. Sometimes you are there in situations where there is no trust in centralized institutions, or these centralized institutions do not exist at all. And in that case, blockchain can create trust between parties that normally would have been created by these intermediate or centralized parties. Therefore, I think that it is in some situations much easier to implement blockchain technology in ICT4D contexts, because in the global north, we have to compete with intermediate parties who are quite powerful if we want to do blockchain projects. And perhaps in the global south, you have less of these centralized parties. So it's, I think, much easier then to diffuse blockchain technology. Well, what is blockchain technology? It's actually not that difficult. You have to imagine a large, very large table, and the table consists of rows. And normally those tables are stored and administered centrally. And with blockchain, this table is distributed amongst all the parties that are involved in the blockchain. And that's about, let's say, representation of data. The second thing is that blockchain also allows decentralized and decentralized distributed execution of code. So also for processing tasks, you don't need intermediate parties, but you can do that fully decentralized. And that's in blockchain called smart contracts. Now, to explain you a bit how it works, I use the Bitcoin as an example. Here you have the situation that user A wants to transfer $100 or euros to user B. And in the traditional situation, we use banks for that. So user E has a subscription at a bank account and at the bank, and user B has also a subscription at usually a different bank. User A directs his bank to pay 100 euros to user B. The first bank pays the money to the second bank, and the second bank pays the money to user B. And what happens in terms of tables is that the first bank keeps track of the transactions done by user A, which is a decrement of 100 euros. And the second bank keeps a table which looks quite similar, but now with the bank accounts of people with the second bank. So here there is a table that user B gets the 100 euros. That's what the administration does. And with blockchain, this looks slightly different. The first thing that you see is that we don't have banks anymore, meaning that there is no centralized party. And so what happens still from a conceptual point of view is that user E pays 100 euros to user B, but without any bank involved. And what happens right now is that each end user, so each user, keeps track of a table, and this table now consists of the person who pays, so the from account, and the person who gets paid, so the to account, and the amount of money that's paid. So in this example, 100 euro. And each participant, so this is precisely how it works in the Bitcoin, each participant, so each user, keeps track of this table. So, and essentially this table is replicated over all users that exist. And in the Bitcoin, there are thousands of these users. So that means that thousands of these replicas do exist. Now, the obvious question is, of course, here, can I cheat? And yes, you can cheat, of course, because if I can administrator my own table as user A, for example, I can reduce the amount of 100 euros to 50 euros. And if user B still administers 100 euros, then the question is on the table, who is right? Is it 50 euros or is it 100 euros? And what we say on blockchain is that these distributed tables, or these decentralized tables with all users, should always reflect the same truth. So there cannot be multiple truths of the reality. There is only one truth, which means that all the tables should be consistent. And how do we achieve that? Well, we achieve that as follows. Transactions like the one I explained are grouped into blocks, and blocks are signed. And in computer science, there are different ways to sign data, basically, and one of them is hashing. I provided a link where you can play a little bit with hashes to see how it works. But basically, the idea of a hash is that for each transaction, a number is calculated, and that that number uniquely identifies that transaction. In theory, that's not completely true because you can clashes of these hashes, but that's a bit more advanced topic. So it's important to know that if I change something in this transaction, for example, the amount, then also the hash will change. And in that sense, it serves as a digital signature of the transaction.
Hmm.
It's very computationally easy to calculate those hashes. So how does it prevent me from changing the block afterwards, say changing the 100 euros to 50 euros? Well, it doesn't really help because these 100 euros I calculate a new hash, and then I'm finished, you would say. So how do we prevent that? Well, we prevent that by making or by finding the hash, making that very difficult in a computational sense. And we do that in two ways. First of all, we relate the block to the previous block, like this. So the block uses or includes the previous hash from the previous block. Which ensures that if you have to, if you change, let's say, a transaction of half a year ago, you have to change that follow. And is we have a cryptographical puzzle. And the cryptographical puzzle is as follows. This is specifically for the Bitcoin. You have to calculate a so-called number that's called the nonce in such a way that the hash satisfies some requirements. And in the Bitcoin, the requirement is that the hash should have some number of leading zeros. And the number of leading zeros is called the difficulty level, which increases over time, because what we see in the blockchain or the Bitcoin is that over time, the people who participate in the Bitcoin increase. That means more computing power, so the puzzle is more quickly solved by all the parties in the ecosystem. And that's why we have to increase the difficulty level. And once someone in the ecosystem finds the valid nonce, he broadcasts that nonce to the others. They can easily validate it because I told you that once you have the data, it's computationally very easy to verify the hash. And once that's the case, it's accepted. And by doing this, it's extremely difficult to change a transaction that happens in the past, for example, changing it from 100 euros to 50 euros. And this makes it possible that we can do financial transactions with having any trusted party, such as a bank in between, and we can do it in a fully decentralized way. There is lots of criticism on the Bitcoin as an example. The consensus mechanism, by the way, used in the Bitcoin is called proof of work. And the proof of work consensus protocol has one big advantage, namely that it consumes lots and lots of computing power, and it also therefore consumes lots and lots of electricity power. Let's say the power, the electricity power required to run the Bitcoin network as a whole today is comparable to the electricity energy consumption of a medium-sized European country, which is huge. So it generates lots of electricity consumption, and related to that, lots of CO2 emission, which is not what we want today. That's one of the criticisms on the Bitcoin. So and because it consumes so much electricity, typically we have calculated that a Bitcoin transaction, so simply payment via the Bitcoin, costs around 40 euros. And many researchers in the Bitcoin often use the situation that you want to offer a pizza, or to buy a pizza and pay it with your Bitcoin. Well, if I buy a pizza for 10 euros and I have to pay 40 euros to clear the transaction, you immediately see the problem here. So other consensus mechanisms are developed. One of them is proof of stake. That's what Ethereum wants to go to follow. There, the consensus is not reached by solving a cryptographic puzzle, but by your stake in the network for how many coins you possess. Intel has developed another solution that's a proof of elapsed time. That's very CO2 friendly. The disadvantage is that it requires an Intel processor. That's how Intel tries to get money out of it. There are so-called permission blockchains, which use various voting mechanisms like the Byzantine fault tolerance mechanism. And this is a bit too detailed to explain that, but this is a protocol that also is very CO2 friendly, but has serious scalability issues in the terms of nodes. So the question on the table is why to use blockchain at all? There are many blockchain projects in the world, and many of them fail because, to my opinion, they have a very bad business case. And the real key business case for blockchain is that you have to break the power of the middleman or want to do that. So in the Bitcoin example, the banks, in the ecosystem examples, Facebook, WeChat, and so on. So you really have to want to break the power of the middleman. That's really the most important requirement for any successful Bitcoin blockchain project. And the second reason could be a lack of reliable, trusted, centralized institutions, which perhaps is for ICT contexts important. So if there's nothing to break, then it means that there's also not an intermediate party who can create a trust, and you have to create a trust in other ways, and blockchain can help in that sense. So those are, I think, the most important reasons to use blockchain. And in relation to what I explained earlier, it can help to build a decentralized ecosystem without the need for powerful centralized parties like Amazon, WeChat, and so on. What's important to know, and this is my I have 2 slides and then I'm finished. What is important to know is that blockchain technology uses itself or requires itself an ecosystem. And because the example of the Bitcoin, I explained to you that there is a huge electricity bill. Well, someone has to pay that electricity bill, and in the Bitcoin, that's paid with Bitcoins itself. So if you solve the cryptographical puzzle that I explained to you, then you'll receive a reward for that. And that reward should pay for your electricity bill. And that makes it very interesting from a business modeling perspective, because what we see here is that a technical solution, which Bitcoin actually is, has a very close interaction with the business model and payments that are done, in this case, in terms of Bitcoins. But Bitcoin is not only a technology, it's also an ecosystem with payments for energy, Bitcoins themselves, and so on. And the same holds for smart contracts. If you know Ethereum, you probably know also the Ether, which is the payment model that Ethereum uses for executing a line of code. And again, there you see an interaction between, let's say, hardcore computer science aspects and how we pay for computing power in this example. So to wrap up, what should be happen, I think, to create fair ecosystems? Well, there are a couple of things. So at least in the EU, I think that on the policy level, this should be centralized. This should be stimulated. So decentralized platforms, the corresponding legislation, which is really an issue, and the technology should be stimulated. What you see that the EU is doing is that they fine large US firms, for example, Google and Facebook and so on have received huge fines from the European Commission because they violated all kinds of laws. But what I think would better work is to have a positive incentive. So fines is something afterwards. What I think would help is if the EU would facilitate the development of decentralized ecosystems in the EU and other areas. So you can criticize Facebook and Google and so on a lot, but the question on the table is, what's the alternative? And the alternative is sufficiently there now, I think. It would be a good direction if you would invest in this. As computer scientists, we want to offer software for this to do decentralized ecosystems. And as I told you, decentralized fair ecosystems come with decentralized fair governance. You want also to have software facilities for that. In the blockchain world, we call that on-chain governance, meaning that the blockchain itself should have computational facilities for doing decentralized governance. There are a few blockchains who are doing that, Tezos, for example, but it is very limited, in my opinion, still, and lots of possibilities for doing research over there. So how to do decentralized governments? Because in the case of Facebook, it's simple, and Google, then they decide. But how can we design a system where a community decides about which direction to take? That's decentralized government, and you need software for that. And so on the technical level, there are many research issues. If I really focus on blockchain, there are lots and lots of technical issues if you're interested. For example, concerning scalability, if you look at the Bitcoin, it can support many nodes in terms of scalability, but the transaction volume is very low. So Bitcoin is typically 6 to 7 transactions per second that it can process. And if you look at the transaction per second that we have worldwide, it's really not a story, actually. So Bitcoin is very poor in the transaction volume it supports, and can in no way can be in its current form be an alternative for handling payment. Another thing is the other way around. So scalability in terms of nodes. If you look at most blockchain platforms that are based on the Byzantine fault tolerance model, that's precisely the other way around. It has a high scalability in number of transactions, but a very low scalability in the number of nodes it can support. And that's also not what you want. So here there are many technical issues still. What I think is that on government, so decentralized governments that is supported on chain, so on the blockchain is needed. Tezos is doing that. You have also the notion of decentralized autonomous organizations where they do this type of work, where they really try to build governance procedures and so on the blockchain with the corresponding functionality. Blockchain platforms like Bitcoin and Ethereum are actually very poor in terms of decentralized governments. With Bitcoin, they have a sort of process which is very weakly defined, in my opinion, and where only a couple of hundred people are involved in practice. And with Ethereum, it's even much worse. And the final problem that we currently have for deploying blockchains to implement the decentralized fair ecosystems is standardization. In the database world, you have SQL as a query language, which is a sort of standard that all huge databases support, with their own dialects, of course, but still they support structured query language. We don't have a similar mechanism yet for blockchains. There are a number of big blockchains compatible with each other. They cannot talk with each other in a reasonable way. So if you, for example, decide for your ecosystem to build your stuff on Hyperledger Fabric, which is mainly an initiative of IBM, you really commit yourself to IBM, and that's precisely what you do not want in a decentralized fair ecosystem, because IBM gets way too much power then. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Yap, for an awesome presentation. Sorry, I was offline for a bit. So as usual, the questions can come in from the raised hands or the chat. I already see questions.
Yeah, so
yeah.
the 51% from 51% attack. Yeah, so for those who don't know, the 51% attack in the Bitcoin is the attack where you possess 51% of the processing power in the network. And once you possess 51% of the processing power in the Bitcoin network, you can basically do what you want. Meaning you can cheat. And of course, that's not what we want. And I think it is extremely relevant these days, because what we see is that lots of Bitcoin nodes, so the miners as they are called, are concentrated in China because of the cheap energy prices over there. And that means that, let's say, lots of computing power, which relates to this 51% attack, is concentrated in China today. That's not what you want. You want to have it more distributed over the world. So yes, the 51% becomes an increasing problem, I think.
Yeah. So I think there was a question before that from Anwar. I don't know if you'd like to just ask the question.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I like the fact that you looked at it from a holistic point of view. So not only the Bitcoin system itself, but also the existing system and the comparison between both. You included also not only the financial issues, but also the political and social issues, which I believe are intrinsic part of what we are discussing. And as a person who is very involved in sustainability, I'm very concerned, of course, about the high amount of CO2 emissions caused by Bitcoin calculations or blockchain calculations. But on the other side, I think we should have a fair system of comparison between the existing system and a new system based on blockchain technology, in which we compare all the advantages and disadvantages. So there is a disadvantage of energy usage, but for example, we have to look at all the banks, the energy consumption of all the banks, the money that is spent also on the system itself, and also the social and political impact of what I call liberalization of the world communities, instead of being operating in a world where monopolies are dictating what is happening. So what is your opinion about this?
Yeah, so thank you for your question, Anwar. So yeah, it's you're completely right, of course. Yeah, so just starting with the Bitcoin. So the Bitcoin will never make it. We wrote a paper actually a couple of years ago where we analyzed the Bitcoin ecosystem with all the parties involved, and then it simply shows that it cannot work on the long term. And what you see today is to my belief that the Bitcoin is completely derailed. It was initially positioned, of course, as a payment system, and it's now more a speculation or even a gambling system, I would say. So you shouldn't look or Bitcoin is interesting to discuss because everyone knows it and so on, but it is not the way how it should be done, I believe. And the energy assumption is really a problem, but there is lots and lots of research going on better consensus protocols. So I think that there are already better consensus protocols available, and that research continues. So I think that will work out. The other, let's say, from a more political point of view, if you look at the Bitcoin, it's in the US at least stimulated, for example, by people coming from the Tea Party company, company for Tea Party, and well, those people are against any form of government. That's basically what they say. Yeah? So everything that has to do with institutions or government or, well, is bad, and that's why the Bitcoin is so extreme, because in the Bitcoin there is no central party at all. So you have many blockchain platforms where there are still some functions centralized simply because it's very expensive or very difficult to decentralize them. So there are all kinds of variations, and Bitcoin is simply very extreme, and also where it comes from a political point of view. And I'm not saying that we that's I think unavoidable. That's a point that has to be taken into account if you decentralize stuff. What functions do we decentralize, and what functions should be decentralized simply because it's more efficient, or we want to have a party we can rely on, and so on. So the Bitcoin is, in my position, way too extreme. I present it usually because it spans all kinds of discussions. And that you have to consider it, let's say, with environmental. So the Bitcoin is completely unacceptable in terms of environmental pollution, of course. But there are better solutions. But you have also to legal is, I think, very important, because there are many initiatives surrounding the blockchain community. For example, computational legal contracts, which are very interesting, because basically what we want to do is to present legal contracts in a computational form so that the computer can do something with it. But that requires, for example, involvement of lawyers, and also on the longer term in legislation of countries. So what you see in the blockchain community quite often is that there is a very technical community. So in our university, for instance, we have a distributed computing group, which is very, very technical oriented. And those are people who know cryptography very well, and so on. And there is a much smaller community, in my opinion, who considers more the societal impact of these types of technologies and so on. And that society of that should increase. And that's actually why we at the FU we launched quite some initiatives. For example, the Aurora network that we have, where we have now developing a master on digital society and global citizenship to look at these issues, but also other initiatives we take. So I fully agree with you in that sense.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I think there were a few other questions. Sorry, I went on and off, so I can't see some of them. But yeah, I think Brian, a question from Brian about processing power, because the question is, if you decentralize, if you're able to decentralize blockchain systems, there is still the question of the processing power, which then puts the power back in the hands of those who have enough capacity to do processing. So the question is, how do we handle this?
Yeah. So yeah. Well. So the interesting what he says is, when we need it decentralized, who will dictate that? That's an interesting question. That refers to the issue of meta-governments. Decentralization needs governments, as I explained. But who will decide that we are going to decentralize at all? And well, if you look at the issue of meta-governments, you're pretty soon, well, in democracies, it's the parliament. For example, in other systems, it's obviously someone else. But this is part of the governance problems that you have to address in case of decentralized governments. And in centralized governments, it's very easy. There is one person, the boss, basically. But in decentralized governments, you will end at negotiations, voting in various forms with delegation. And, well, there is a whole bunch of literature how to do that. and that's much more complicated, of course, than the centralized case. And the question above, if you would be a politician, what would you do to transform our technical system and economical system? Well, I hope I explained a bit that I think that there is here a rule for, at least in Europe, for the European Commission. I'm perfectly okay with that they find Facebook and Google and so on. But it would be much nicer if they allocate large budgets for really developing stuff for decentralized ecosystems and supporting technologies. Because that would be a real answer to these big US tech firms. Everyone is complaining about big US tech firms, which is okay with me, but the real question is, what are you going to do against it? And the answer is not creating a big EU tech firm or many EU tech firms. The answer is having systems in place and facilities and laws and so on to create decentralized systems. And that's not a sound what I hear too often from the European Commission.
Okay.
Yeah.
More questions. Yeah.
The second question: is there a blockchain site or platform that Graphic? That I don't know that question. The answer to that question, to be honest. I also don't have Bitcoin, so I don't have the problem.
I think that there are, but they are monitoring sites, but I don't know them, but I know they exist. So.
Yeah, and then the last question of Andre Bart is interesting. So, yeah, so he says basically that blockchain can offer trust, but it is difficult to understand the arguments and systematics. Well, yeah, so this is interesting because what you see with the Bitcoin is that there are many miners, tens of thousands, and but they want to earn money basically, and most of them don't understand the Bitcoin protocol at all. While if something changes to the Bitcoin protocol, which can have severe impact, for example, the payment if you mine a block, then it's not very always easy for those people to understand the change in governance, basically. And this is a huge problem to, let's say, make the transition from, let's say, the technical working of a decentralized ecosystem to people who have to vote about stuff. Because lots of people, also in the Bitcoin, don't actually know what they are voting about. So I see this as a huge issue, and there is some work. For example, we look now at contracting. So yeah, I explained to you that in blockchain you have smart contracts, but as far as in most cases with most platforms, the notion of contract is a bit misleading. It's more you have to see the contract in what we know from programming, that you have an interface that you stick to and that you keep stable. That's the contract. It's not so it's contract in terms of computing. It's not a contract in terms of law and or legal rules. And there are now some initiatives where they develop more declarative languages to specify really legal contracts such that they can be enforced by computational smart contracts on the blockchain. But this research is only starting, but it can be a huge contribution to making insightful to users with no technical knowledge what actually a smart contract does. Right now, the situation is that you need to have a master degree to understand what a smart contract is, and a master degree in computer science. That's not the situation that we want to have, of course.
There's still a question.
So I wanted to ask a question, if possible.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really insightful. I was actually curious about the transformation of Bitcoin. So currently it's working as a proof of stake, proof of work, sorry. And you mentioned that changing it from.
I think there's someone wants Jackson.
Francis, we don't hear you anymore. Can you continue your question, please?
Oh, yeah, of course. So as you mentioned just a second ago, that most of the people who mine Bitcoin or have Bitcoin have no clue what is happening in the background with the smart contracts and blockchain. What do you think if it would be feasible for Bitcoin to change from proof of work to proof of stake in order to be environmentally friendly? So it would be more sustainable and more usable as a currency and instead of not as a gold. Like currently, because people think of it as a gold because it's so rare as the computational power and the price. If we can change it like Ethereum to proof of stake, even though there are no active developers of Bitcoin currently.
Yeah, well, I think that Ethereum does not make this change for nothing, without any, let's say, benefits. The question is, of course, if a proof of stake is the best consensus protocol for these types of applications. So we recently looked at a distributed autonomous organization. So there the idea is to do really the on-chain governance, right? So to support governments as part of the blockchain process itself. And their proof of stake cost. So proof of stake is the idea that if you own more Bitcoins or you own more Ethers, then you have more voting rights, basically. And yeah, the question is if there is a correlation between, let's say, good decision making and specifically, as I defined it, fair decision taking, and the amount of Bitcoins or Ethers that you own. And what we saw with this decentralized autonomous organization is that, so this was also based on proof of stake. So the more stake you had, the higher your decision power. What we saw there is that if we would evaluate the decisions afterwards, that not always the best decisions were taken, in our opinion, based on the stakes that you have. So I'm not convinced that for Bitcoin and also for Ethereum, let's say from a fairness perspective, proof of stake is the best consensus protocol.
Sorry to interrupt, but to further go to the question, wouldn't limiting stakers through, like, for example, let's say 30 Ether or like having a limit give us decentralization compared to proof of work? Because currently you cannot say, oh, you cannot mine with, oh, I'm sorry, you cannot have 10 more than 10 miners. Oh, we are out. But in here you can say, oh, like 3 Ether is your maximum staking power, and that's it.
Yeah, of course, you can have all kinds of refinements of proof of stake protocol. That's true. To be frank, I don't know what you propose, what the influence would be on the scalability and power consumption issue, because the reason why they do this is to reduce the power consumption of the network. I really don't know, to be honest.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your questions. I still have one question, Jaap, and since our chair has left us because of technical problems, this Francis.
Oh, I'm still here.
Oh, you're back. Oh, then I'll hand over to you again, Francis.
Oh, yes. So if there are any more questions, we can have a few more questions, maybe 1 or 2.
Yes, I would like then to ask a question to Jaap. Yeah, we are here talking about ICT4D, and we are talking about decolonizing technologies and trying to bridge the digital divide. But if we see what we have seen in the past few days, artificial intelligence and blockchain technologies are actually creating a larger divide, and that has to do with, on the one hand, so you concentrate technology and knowledge. It concentrates also, let's say, finances, money, in the hands of those who have the knowledge and the power and the decision-making power. And it has also the network effect, in which if you connect everyone, then suddenly the powerful come into control. So how can we conceptually invent a fair ecosystem for, let's say, to bridge the digital divide and to make the countries and the regions that are less, digitally connected in a way to benefit from the digital society? It's a big question, but just to throw the question at you.
Yeah, well, I think in principle, by decentralizing stuff, right? I mean, what you see now, I didn't discuss that, but at the Amazon slide, but one of the things that Amazon now does with their SpaceX company. So by the way, Amazon has also its own space company. They deploy these satellites massively at an orbit of 600 kilometers, I believe. Yeah, why do they do it? Also to gain dominance in Africa and all those countries who have not such a good internet infrastructure. And that's a very good example of, again, this monopolistic behavior they expose. I believe that let's say in the global north, it's not very easy to fight this centralization trend because it's already there. All those companies that are doing it have very powerful positions and so on. I believe that in situations where they have a less dominant position, it's actually easier to employ decentralized ecosystems because you at least don't have to fight the competition that much. So I think decentralization is the way to, basically the way to go here to avoid it. And well, as I told you, I think the European Commission, for example, and for the US, I don't know, but I can imagine they're the same. They do not a very good job in facilitating this decentralization movement. And we shouldn't make that mistake in ICT4D context. So community-driven projects, which is by definition decentralized, I would say, is very important in that sense. The point is that, yeah, from a technological point of view, and I hope I explained that also a bit, there are still a lot of things to do to make this decentralization truth, to make that true, because decentralized systems are, for some people, synonym to decentralized computing, which is very highly technical and as Andre pointed out, not understandable to most of the people. So there's lots of work to do there. I'm not saying that it is easy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So maybe we'll take one, I see one last hand, so maybe we can take one last question from Andre.
Yeah, thank you. So I was wondering, in your talk you said you definitely think that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general are probably not going to make it. So if you look at the field of AI, AI is already there for many decennia, and we've had this AI winter. And so let's say that your predictions become reality and cryptocurrency will fail. And don't you think that that might cause let's say an AI winter for blockchain? And what should we as computer scientists or as policy makers do to prevent this from happening, or to make sure that we keep investing in these initiatives which have high potential? So at least as I see it currently, cryptocurrencies are basically the only applications of blockchain that really have gotten some traction. So there's lots of initiatives, for instance, in supply chain tracking in all kinds of fields, and there's lots of startups, but none of them have seen, at least in my respect, to have gain traction. It's only cryptocurrency. So don't you think that if cryptocurrency fails, that maybe the whole blockchain hype will also die down?
Yeah, so so my remark with let's say the sustainability of the whole thing, so was primarily related to Bitcoin. Bitcoin uses proof of work as a consensus mechanism, and proof of work is really a problem. We made calculations and so on, quite detailed analysis that you pretty soon can show that it's not beneficial. It's basically a pyramid game. So the whole proof of work thing is that's my claim, not feasible on the long term. And I explained also that there are other consensus protocols, and of course lots of research is now done about these consensus protocols. So, and there are much better alternatives than proof of work in the Bitcoin. So I think there is still hope on that side. But yeah, you're completely right. So there was recently a research where they did on GitHub all the Bitcoin projects of the past few years. And I believe something like 90% of those projects were dead after a couple of months. And well, I have seen many blockchain projects in the past. And well, I think also something like 90% of those projects are, I would say, bad blockchain projects. Often they are in the phase that companies want to play a bit with technology, to understand the technology. But the real key point is that blockchain is a distributed technology, and distributed technologies are expensive. So it's much cheaper to put somewhere a centralized database and to keep there the information and to trust the person or the company who owns that database, and then to replicate those databases all over the world. It's simply a more expensive technology in terms of development and in terms of operation. So you should have a very good business case for any blockchain project because it's so expensive to do. And there are these cases do exist, and all these cases have one thing in common, namely that at least they want to reduce the middleman or to eliminate the middleman at all. So that's really a requirement for every blockchain project. And for example, yeah, with this supply chain oriented blockchains, yeah, what you see in practice is that many supply chains are dominated by one party. For example, if we take the grocery in the Netherlands, Albert Heijn dominates a really substantial supply chain. And why not store all the information at Albert Heijn? If we trust Albert Heijn, then we don't need such an expensive technology at all. The other problem with this, we looked at the projects where they used a blockchain to track a fish that was taken from the ocean. So what you then often have is the proof of originality. So you have to prove that a fish is caught in the North Sea or in some other waters, whatever, because there are all kinds of regulations to comply with. But that whole system depends on the fact whether the person who enters the fish into the blockchain enters also the right location, right? So it's very easy to cheat with that. You can just fill in what you want. So we're doing now a project in the field of electricity, that you have there the same with green electricity, that you have to prove that the electricity is really generated by solar cells, so green electricity. And there we now embed a chip into the solar panel, which really can testify that that electricity comes from that solar panel. And that's very difficult to cheat with. But these are huge problems in these supply chain projects. And in the first question is with these supply chain projects, is there a party where we can host the data that we trust? And in many cases, those parties are there. So no need for blockchain. So I believe that for the blockchain projects that are now ongoing, 90% are not good blockchain projects. And if you, for example, look at IBM has, I think right now, the most dominant platform, which is Hyperledger Fabric. Well, a couple of months ago, they announced that they will reduce their development efforts in Fabric significantly. So this is a very important signal to the industry, namely that IBM does not want to invest that amount of money anymore than they originally did. So yes, I think the blockchain community should be very anxious for a AI winter. I think precisely the same will happen. That does not mean that AI or blockchain is completely useless. Of course, there are good cases, but this is the difference between the hype and a serious business case. And the same we'll see with blockchain. That's my prediction.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, and thank you to the participants for a very good time of interaction, very interesting questions that the IT community and everyone else need to answer over time. At this point, I'll hand over back to Anna. Thank you all for making today interesting. So Anna, back to you.
For sharing this day and to doing a presentation, and I think we had 145 people watching, so this is really the success presentation of the webinar, which was overall very successful. We started with 83 people and we're ending with 145, so that is fantastic. I think the students can be very happy with this wonderful webinar that was offered to us by the speakers. Yeah. For the participants, this is the end of the webinar, but for the students, this is just the end of the first week of their 4-week ICT4D in the field course. So next Monday, we will see each other again, and we will have a lot of things to discuss related to all the lectures that we have seen, related to the AI and in the Global South that we are trying to tackle in this course, and to build prototypes, to tackle use cases, to talk with communities. So there will be a lot of interesting things to do in the next few days. So I thank you all very much for your participation, for your nice questions, for the good discussion, for being here together and to be part of this community that we want to establish, an international community over 3 continents interested in fair ecosystems, in fair technologies, in technologies that really serve people. So thank you all very much, and hope to see you back, at least our students. And thank you all participants again. So it was the webinar, and good weekend to all.